Origin of quarters in the sense of living area. I was explaining to my son that HQ stood for headquarters, when he surprised me by dividing the word into head and quarters. I had never considered this word thusly before, but it's obvious to me now, the quarters for the head. But then as I explained that quarters was another word for a building or room, I realized how little it fits. We discussed it over our lunch circle, and came up with some theories. It originally cost a quarter to rent a room. Military bases were divided into 4 parts, each of which contained some buildings for particular functions. Rented space was paid by the quarter, in the annual sense. Doing some research, this is what we found. An explanation of give no quarter says that quarter developed from a 4th part of something, progressing from sky and space, to compass directions, to cities and towns, and that there was a parallel development on a domestic scale, and a part of a house also became called a quarter, but it sheds no light on how that came to be. So it remains plausible that quarters might be related to dividing a house into 4 parts, similar to number 2. This discussion of quarter supports the idea that quarters comes from dividing a house into 4 parts, but also mentions quarter days, which are days of the year on which it is usually contracted that rents should be paid and houses or lands entered upon or quitted. This lends some plausibility to number 3. But then there is this blog article that states unequivocally and unsourcedly that the origin is none of the above, but in fact derives from a French word which means separate from. How did quarters come to mean housing or accommodation?
Etymonline has this to say on quarters. Military dwelling place, 1590s, from quarter, n, in sense a portion of a town. The military sense is in quartermaster, mid-15c, and might be behind the phrase give, no, quarter, 1610s, on the notion of to provide a prisoner with shelter. The verb quarter to put up soldiers is recorded from 1590s. Quartermaster appears to be from something unrelated to fourths. Mid-15c, from Father Cartier Maitre or du Quartiermeister, originally a ship's officer whose duties included stowing of the hold, later, circa 1600, an officer in charge of quarters and rations for troops. Although I am weak at French, it appears that quartier means area or district. Note that the dates for quartermaster are before quarter, mid-15c versus 1590s. This implies that quartermaster transferred first and then people began using quarter due to the use of quartermaster. Transferring the meaning of quarters into a non-military dwelling place seems reasonable and, therefore, the short answer to your question is that quarters appears to have come from France by way of quartermaster. Edit. My hunch on why quarter came from quartermaster, as opposed to Etymonline just telling us it did, is the inclusion of master in the term led people to assume that they were masters of something. It was logical to call that something a quarter. The idea of quartering up soldiers would mean to provide for them. This would be the quartermaster's responsibility. Lodging was most likely included in that, and the perception of master of lodging makes sense. Yeah, the process by which quarter goes from meaning divide into 4 parts to apportion or apart has analogues. It's a sort of semantic slide or shift that I love discovering. In a particular Spanish language text I was reading, a speaker commands his listener, adocenate. It literally means, dozenize yourself, which led me to think, well, that's odd. But further reflection led me to see that it was part of an exhortation to the listener to multiply his efforts, his presence, and so on. Quarter has apparently undergone something of the same process. So quarter goes from meaning to divide into 4 portions, its plain Latin origin, to meaning either one of those 4 portions, or to divide into portions generally. From the idea of those 4 portions, it comes to mean any portion. The military portion is the military quarters, just like the French part of town is the French quarter, as in New Orleans. A smaller and smaller area will suffice as one's personal quarters, until quarters comes to mean lodging in general, though with a military connotation. It might not only be lodging, or lodging in particular, but a station generally, including a battle station. In the US Navy, they call it general quarters, where you are to position yourself for readiness in battle. The British Navy, our own antecedent, spoke of beating to quarters because a drum was used to transmit the command to go to quarters. From there, it is a short shift to the chief's quarters, which naturally will include study and meeting spaces, a headquarters, if you will. Great fun question, isn't it? I hope your son got a cookie out of the deal. Smile.
The NOID reports that quarters means rooms or lodgings, especially those allocated to servicemen or to staff in domestic service. The online etymology dictionary reports that quarters, used to mean the portion of a town identified by the class or race of people who live there, is first attested in 1520s. The word was then extended to also mean the portion of a house identified by the class or the race of people living there.
If you want to buy channel, please consider subscribing.